Yes. You need to rededicate your life today.
So, good to be back. Good to see you all. Late happy Easter. Although the calendar seems to have shifted backwards.
Yeah.
So, how long is it supposed to last?
It's going to be 84 on Friday, I think.
Oh, okay. So, anyway, it is, when I'm not here, I'm just down the hall at
Perennial.
Yeah, Perennial, which is where Chad Mustain, who will be teaching us today, is a regular and sometimes teacher. First-time teacher for Foundations of Faith, so welcome. Thank you. I'll introduce him more in a little bit, but let's do announcements first. And I read this earlier and forgot to make notes about what I wanted to highlight, so let me see if I can remember. Turquoise tables. It's almost time for that again. For those of you that don't remember, about this time last year, we painted a bunch of tables turquoise out in the parking lot. I think we might do that again. We already have an inventory of turquoise tables, right? But we need.
Well, there's going to be 9 more, so there's going to need some help painting again for a few. There won't be as many this time. But
okay.
Because we already have 25 painted.
It's this movement that started down in Austin. I forgot what the church was that started it down there. But the idea is that you just take a turquoise table, you put it on your front lawn somewhere that, you know, I guess, I don't know, is feng shui a concept that you use for your front lawn, or is that interior decorating? Anyway, put it on your front lawn, and then the idea is that you just sit out there and sort of have an open invitation for your neighbors to stop by.
You have to commit to once a month.
Oh, okay. It's what? Well, I don't know.
That's what it said in there somewhere.
Oh, did it? Okay.
To commit to once a month. I don't know.
Okay. So anyway, more details about that in the worship folder. What was the other thing that I wanted to mention? Oh, we've got a full-page announcement / advertisement for the upcoming trip to the Holy Land. It's been 6 years since the last time. Who went on the last? Yeah.
6 years. It's been 6 years.
It was
Okay.
2012.
Ken, I know you had been asking about that.
I was one who lit the fuse.
You got it
Okay.
going. Yep.
Yeah.
I can bring pictures as a preview for you.
Okay.
There's 3 of us from this class signed up already.
Oh,
So,
good deal.
yeah.
All right, well, anyway, more details about that. That's coming up in October. Late October, early November is when the trip will be. More details about that. George and, it's Rabbi Nancy Catston.
That's David Stern's wife.
Oh, this is, okay, that's his wife. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
She's quite good.
And,
2 rabbis in the house.
yeah.
Mm-hmm. Oh, and he's not going this time.
I bet there's some good debate.
Oh, Jazz Stand is coming up this week, Tuesday, April 10th, 7 p.m. Lena Conquest Trio. Looks pretty good. And let's not forget that in June we have CBF Assembly, Cooperative Baptist Fellowship annual meeting. It's in Dallas this year. So they're June 13th to 15th. So they're looking for volunteers to help with various registration, hospitality, ushering, among other roles. So if you want to sign up for that, there's information about how to go about doing that. Have I overlooked anything? Anybody want to add anything?
The concert Saturday.
Yes, in the back.
What was it? The jazz concert. What's
Free
the
concert with Kate Campbell this coming Saturday.
Oh, yes.
Put your back page up.
Is that the back page ad?
Some pictures to pay for it. Did you know?
Oh, here we go. Page 7. Page 7. Kate Campbell. Yes. All right. Well, if not, prayer requests, we'll pass them around. Get that started over here with Robert. And welcome Chad Mustain. Most of y'all, I think everybody knows Chad. Heather Mustain's other half, better half. I was part of the Mustain team. Chad is a chaplain at Baylor University Medical Center, Gaston, AKA Big Baylor. And I was just sharing with Chad, or we were talking about how many chaplains there are that actually are members or participate at Wilshire. Joe Gross, who will be teaching here in a few weeks, is another. He's a retired chaplain. And was he your former supervisor, or was he?
He was before my time, but he was. I mean, he's a legendary director at Big Baylor.
He was a
So-
Stephen Minister trainer originally.
Yeah.
Right.
He trained us.
Well, I was telling Chad that I think that the people that work as chaplains, their approach to Scripture, I think their own personal and professional experiences give them a lot of insight on how to really approach Scripture and find meaning and interpretation in it. And I think you'll notice that too. You notice it in the way Joe teaches. I've been, Chad teaches quite frequently with the perennial class, and so I've got to hear him a lot too, and I really enjoy it, and I really like your chaos. What was that? What was that?
Oh yeah. So a central part of my pastoral care practice and my kind of personal theology is a way I've come to understand chaos, because it's so central to what happens in the hospital environment. And so I understand chaos to be Christ here amidst our sufferings, so that in the midst of the chaos and the mess of life, that somewhere, and sometimes it's really hard to find, but Christ is somewhere in the midst of it. So that's something I often share in classes that I teach in, because I think chaos, for better or for worse, is central to how the world tends to operate, because of some of the brokenness of the world and systems that are present in the world. So yeah, that somewhere in the midst of that, Christ is still present with us.
All right, well, welcome.
Member of Pathways Committee too.
Yes, I failed to mention that, yes. You've been on the Pathways Committee for...
This is my first official year. I was,
Okay, that's right. We just got you on board officially this year.
Yeah, I'm a big fan of baseball, and so I joke that I signed a 1-year contract with 3 option years. Andy Brookshire was the person on the committee of committees or whatever that reached out to me because there was someone that wasn't able to fulfill their term. So that's kind of how he pitched it to me in classic baseball terms. And so yeah, so I've got those player options that I'm continuing to pick up.
My condolences, it's cool for our team.
Yeah, it's, although last night's game was good. I'm a big Joey Gallo fan. He had a good game.
Yeah.
So, yeah. So, well, good. Well, I'm really grateful for the opportunity to be here and to talk through a challenging text in a number of ways. Joshua is a book that, not in its entirety, but much of it is often referred to as a text of terror. President Matthew Dodrell has been teaching, he just wrapped up a 3-week course on texts of terror from Scripture. And these are terrifying Scripture texts that oftentimes are not in the lectionary, so we skip over them and don't preach on them and talk about them. And they deal with really hard topics like genocide and rape and severe mistreatment of women and things like this. And these are texts that are found in the Scriptures that we oftentimes just don't deal with for whatever reason, because it's too hard, because it makes us uncomfortable, because it doesn't fit with our own personal theology. But sometimes we do come across them, and we have to wrestle with them. And so I'm grateful that you guys are choosing to engage this text. So we've got 2 large chunks today. I want to primarily focus on chapter 2. I think that's where the juicy stuff is at. And so I'd like us maybe to begin reading there, and if I can get maybe just a couple readers, and we'll read, you know, kind of in chunks or paragraphs, kind of how it's broken out in the text. But I'd like to read all of chapter 2, and then I'll use that as a springboard for some things to prompt your thought that will hopefully prompt some good discussion. So can I get somebody that would volunteer to maybe read verses 1 through 7 to start out?
Then-
Josh,
Go ahead.
then Joshua's son of Nun sent 2 men secretly from Shittim as spies, saying, "Go view the land, especially Jericho." So they went and entered the house of a prostitute whose name was Rahab, and spent the night there. The king of Jericho was told, some Israelites have come here tonight to search out the land. Then the king of Jericho sent orders to Rahab, bring out the men who have come to you, who entered your house. For they have come only to search out the whole land. But the woman took the 2 men and hid them. Then she said, true, the men came to me, but I did not know where they came from. And when it was time to close the gate at dark, the men went out. Where the men went, I do not know. Pursue them quickly, for you can overtake them. She had, however, brought them up to the roof and hidden them with the stalks of flax that she had laid out on the roof. So the men pursued them on the way to the Jordan, as far as the fords. As soon as the pursuers had gone out, the gate was shut.
Good. Any initial impressions, thoughts, questions that pop out from those first 7 verses before we continue reading?
Sounds
Yeah, I got
cool.
it.
A movie.
A movie? Okay.
Well, you can send them up to the roof and hide them.
Yeah.
She wasn't a very loyal Jerichoite, or whatever you call that.
Okay.
There seems to have been, she seems to have had a motivation that is not apparent from this, that probably was not the motivation of most of the citizens of Jericho.
Okay. Hold on to that. We're going to come back to that thought.
Was it
That's interesting.
customary that there would be, in this wall around the city, it mentions that her home, her house was in the wall? Because that's how she was able to lower them down outside the wall. Was
Yeah.
it customary?
That would have been. If you've ever had an opportunity to travel throughout Europe, you can see this oftentimes that lots of cities, one that comes to mind that I've been to is a city called Chester, and it literally has a wall that goes around the city.
Mhm.
It has a walkway that's on top of the wall, and
Okay.
there's actually homes that are built on top of it, and even kind of inside the wall there are things. So that would be something that was fairly customary.
Okay, I just,
Yeah. Good question, though.
I didn't realize it went this far back, and I know that they're, from medieval times, that's the way all the cities were built.
Yeah.
It may have been the nearest thing they could do to put her outside the city, it was kind of a limbo,
Yeah.
they put her on the edge, you know,
Yeah.
but they didn't want to.
Yeah.
she may not be very well thought of in
Yeah.
the city, the population.
Yeah.
However, they mentioned that some interpretations call her an innkeeper.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so the labeling of Rahab is a really interesting thing in this text. And I don't want to give away too much yet, but I want you to think about layers of violence. We tend to think of this text just as the violence that we see in chapter 6 and in others, which is basically the slaughtering of people under this kind of premise of God gave us this land, so it's our right to kill you kind of thing. Some people would call that manifest destiny. That's a term that is very present in our own country and in our own story, right? So that's one layer of violence, and I think that's the most obvious layer. And I'm hoping we'll get to dig down into some of these other layers. And so, Carrie, you've hit one thing, which is how she is labeled or remembered in the text. And I would suggest that that is an aspect of violence. So, a couple other thoughts. One of my seminary professors, Dr. Nan, who is legendary in her own right. You know Dr. Nan?
No, I was thought about it.
Oh, okay. Yeah, so she suggests, and she's an Old Testament scholar, she suggests that when we see these action verbs like go, so they went, bring out these men that have come to you, she suggests from her own research and study that we are to hear a sexual aspect to their coming and to their going. And so think about it for a second. Why in the world is the first place that these spies go to a prostitute? Were they really interested in like spying out the land, or was there something else going on here?
In the old westerns, it's usually something else going on.
Yes, there is something else possibly going on here. So that's just an interesting thing, that these are men sent by God, but the first thing they do when they arrive is they go and visit. An innkeeper is what some translate. Sometimes that's meant to smooth it over to make it a little less, you know, because talking about prostitution and the factors that kind of sometimes force people into that field is something that's uncomfortable. You know, we might refer to that as a system of oppression, right? So that's a layer of violence that I would suggest that's present in this text. And so as you hear this language of coming and that she goes to them, some scholars would suggest what you were supposed to hear, and we kind of lose that in our English translation, but in the original text, what the original hearers would probably have heard is that there was a very sexual nature to their coming and to their going, to their visiting of one another with this. See, I told you there's some juicy stuff here, right? So let's keep going. So somebody can pick up at verse 8 and read down through, let's see. Yeah, just read and I'll stop you at some point.
Before the spies lay down for the night, she went up on the roof and said to them, I know that the Lord has given you this land, and that a great fear of you has fallen on us, so that all who live in this country are melting in fear because of you. We have heard how the Lord dried up the water of the Red Sea for you when you came out of Egypt, and what you did to Sihon and Og, the two kings of the Amorites east of Jordan, whom you completely destroyed. When we heard of it, our hearts melted in fear, and everyone's courage failed because of you. For the Lord your God is God in heaven above and on the earth below. Now then, please swear to me by the Lord that you will show kindness to my family, because I have shown kindness to you. Give me a sure sign that you will spare the lives of my father and my mother, my brothers and sisters, and all who belong to them, and that you will save us from death. Our lives for your lives, the men assured her. If you don't tell what we are doing, we will treat you kindly and faithfully when the Lord gives us the land. So she let them down by a rope through the window, for the house she lived in was part of the city wall. She said to them, go to the hills so the pursuers will find you. Will not find you. Hide yourselves there 3 days until they return, and then go on your way. Now the men had said to her, this oath you made us swear will not be binding on us unless when we enter the land you have tied this scarlet cord in the window through which you let us down, and unless you have brought your father and mother, your brothers, and all your family into your house. If any of them go outside your house into the street, their blood will be on their own heads. We will not be responsible. As for those who are in the house with you, their blood will be on our head, if a hand is laid on them. But if you tell what we are doing, we will be released from the oath you made us swear. Agreed, she replied, let it be as you say. So she sent them away, and they departed, and she tied the scarlet cord in the window. When they left, they went into the hills and stayed there 3 days, until the pursuers had searched all along the road and returned without finding them. Then the two men started back. They went down out of the hills, forded the river, and came to Joshua, son of Nun, and told him everything that had happened to them. They said to Joshua, the Lord has surely given the whole land into our hands. All of the people are melting in fear because of us. That's where you want me to stop?
Yeah, that's perfect. All right. So there, again, I think is a lot going on in this text, some of which is obvious and some of which takes a bit of digging to see. So what are kind of the first impressions, questions, things that jump out to you as we heard this portion of the text read?
We start to see her motivation.
Okay, and what is her motivation, do you think?
Self-preservation, the preservation of her family.
Okay, so is that a pure motivation, a bad motivation? What do you think?
Typical, I would think.
One that's easy to be sympathetic towards.
Okay.
She's clearly choosing sides.
Yeah.
I mean, which countries and people do all the time in war.
Mhm.
And sometimes they choose the wrong side.
Yeah.
But
She was very knowledgeable about God's plan and the fact
Yes.
that they were going to
Yeah.
have that land.
Yes. So that's a really key observation.
And
She-
what had already happened.
Right.
How did she get that word?
That's a great wondering. So I would suggest another aspect of violence in this text is how we understand Rahab and how she's portrayed throughout. We don't know anything about her. Her name just all of a sudden appears in chapter 2, and then for the most part kind of fades off into oblivion. She's mentioned it one other time in Scripture. Does anyone else know?
The genealogy of Jesus.
Yes. So,
Ew, the plan, man.
yes.
Real.
She's the mother of Boaz.
Yes, very good. So yeah, so we have this figure portrayed as a prostitute, but who is somehow pretty in tune with the workings of God, right? Which is odd because, one, women, what is their place generally in the ancient world?
Subservient.
Subservient,
And
yes.
Not educated.
Not educated, great. What else do we know?
Keep your mouth shut.
Well,
Keep your mouth shut?
nobody but like the priests have direct word from God, right? Supposedly, so.
Yes, and if anyone gets a word from God, it's typically men,
Right.
right? So we have someone who's a Canaanite. She's an outsider, literally and figuratively. She lives on the outside ring of the wall. So she's probably, in a sense, a nobody for multiple reasons. One, because she's a woman. Two, because of her trade or her practice. And, you know, three, she is portrayed as the leader of her household, which again is not something that should have been in this time, right?
But she lived by herself, she wasn't, because I gathered that she, when they said, bring your father and mother and brothers and everything, were they living in that house? For some reason, I got the impression they had their own house.
Yeah, I think you could possibly make an argument both ways. Most of the scholarship I consulted would suggest that they were in the house with her.
Okay.
And that for whatever reason, she has become the head of her household, which would make her another outsider. So that's another level of being kind of an outsider in this text, that men are supposed to be the head of the household, but for whatever reason, she's the one that these spies are dealing with, and she's the one that's negotiating for the good of her family. It's not her father. There's no mention of a husband for her. So she's breaking all kinds of cultural expectations by negotiating on behalf of her family, whether she's viewed as a traitor or whether she's viewed as someone who really cares for others, to say, I don't know how many I can save perhaps, but I'm at least going to work hard to save those that I can.
I'm just curious, if all of you had not studied the Bible as you've studied it, and you had read this for the very first time, as I did, would you have drawn all of that? I didn't, because I didn't know about the connection. What I thought was she has interactions with a lot of people in that profession. And so she probably, conversation drew the fact that there was melting of fear and what had happened east of Jordan and coming out of Egypt.
Yeah.
She had heard all of that through her profession. That's what I read.
Yeah.
And so, but I didn't know about the connection, or I still don't know about the connection. We haven't gotten there yet. So I'm just curious if all of you, inferred that because of your knowledge of what's to come.
But wouldn't travelers, that would have been the first place a traveler would probably go, inside the city. I mean, it would be a place of refuge, whether it was a brothel or whether it was an inn. That would be where a lot of information is like a bartender. Gets a lot of info.
Yeah.
They still use women of the night to pry secrets out of drunken generals.
Oh, it still happens today. This isn't anything that's...
Well, and it makes me wonder if if the people had come in there before, even before this mission with Joshua,
Interesting. Yeah.
they might have been talking to her,
Yeah.
even before the mission was about to take place.
Right.
Like
One
they
of
were
the
not ready for this book.
one of the challenging things when we approach scripture text is there is oftentimes a lot that is assumed. Because we were not the original audience, right? And how we understand how scripture came to be, there's varying opinions, right? I think a lot of times around Wilshire, there's a general consensus that it was formed over the course of time and tradition, and it started out orally and gradually made its way into written forms, but it was edited and perhaps changed maybe, or made to reflect certain agendas and such, but somehow we've come to by this sacred text that we would say, despite how we think we arrived at it, this is a sacred text that God has entrusted to reveal God's self to people, right? So there's a lot of questions that come out of this, and there's varying levels of a first impression of what you can gain. If you read a text, if we were to just read this text again, there would be new observations that would come out, right? And then when you dig in and you do some study, and it depends on who you're studying, if you're reading from the perspective of a man, or a lot of what I'm sharing is written from the perspective of women, and women of color, because there's layers of violence in this text, and there is layers of how scholarship is written too. There's a trade or a field in scholarship called intersectionality, right? It's not just one thing. It's not just women are oppressed, but there's levels of oppression within the experience of women, right? A white woman is going to experience the world differently from a person of color. And a person of color, there's even grades within that, and how if you're African American, but if you're a light-skinned African American, you experience the world one way, but if you're a dark-skinned African American, you experience the world a different way. And if you happen to be an immigrant on top of that, and maybe you have an accent, you experience the world a little bit differently, you know? So there's levels of perspective that are present, and all of these things intersect, so.
It's that way in India too.
Yeah.
The lighter skinned Indian people are
Yes. And so.
The system maintains it in India.
Do you
Yes.
know if her, the definition of maybe of Rahab? I mean, what's just the name? Usually names in Bible.
Yeah, that's a great question. That's not something
And I was trying to look it up.
I yeah.
I think it's interesting that the king knew her, and that when he sent men to her, they believed her and left.
Yeah.
I think that's an interesting.
They might have been customers of hers.
Perhaps. She is somehow a person of influence.
Yeah.
However she came, and again, this is, I think, part of the violence of the text, is that women's stories in Scripture oftentimes aren't told. There's just things that are assumed. Most of the time we know women, unfortunately because of a trade, because women who are traded, you know, women are sexual objects oftentimes. And so this is typically how we know them. Very rarely throughout Scripture is there this really like positive. Typically we know them as so-and-so, the spouse of whomever, which occurs in the genealogy of Jesus that we reference, and I want to highlight a couple things from there.
Well, we found the definition.
Yes?
It says the biblical meaning of the name Rahab is proud, quarrelsome.
Tedious says broad and large.
Okay. Yeah.
Wow.
So we had this question, or this statement that Rahab is mentioned in the genealogy of Jesus. Without looking, anybody else know who else is mentioned? There are 4 women mentioned in the genealogy of Jesus.
Ruth has got to be in there.
Ruth is one, yes.
Mary.
Tamar, yes.
Oh, and Tamar has a story.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, Jacob is going to be teaching the rape of Tamar to us in a few weeks. So.
Okay.
But that's a different Tamar.
Yeah, that's a different
Tamar.
Tamar. But
Yeah.
this Tamar is also called a whore.
Yes.
Do you
Well,
recall
Mary.
which?
Mary.
Well, Mary is in there, but that's
She
not
She doesn't-
specifically.
Oh, isn't Bathsheba?
Yes, but Bathsheba is not
That's right.
named.
No.
She is called
She's the
the
mother.
The
wife
wife
of Uriah.
Yes.
Yes. So there again is this whole thing where women's story, you know, so this is in the genealogy of Jesus. So here's a brief statement I want to read to you regarding that and the importance and why I think this violence of how women are understood is an important part of this text today. It says, Rahab is written into the genealogy of Jesus in Matthew chapter 1. 4 women, Tamar, who played the whore, Rahab, the prostitute, Ruth, who was perhaps sexually forward, and the wife of Uriah, who is Bathsheba. And David coerced her into adultery. This scholar says, the factor most likely uniting the 4 women is their Gentile background. Rahab and Tamar are Canaanites. Ruth was a Moabite, and Bathsheba was married to a Hittite. It says, Matthew was intent on ensuring that the 4 Gentile women appear in Jesus' line of descent, and doing so clearly sending a signal. A universalist perspective would say that the inclusion of the Gentile world must have been important to Matthew. So we get this small snapshot in this text here of someone who is an outsider for many of the reasons we've named, right? She's of the wrong racial background, she's a Canaanite, she's of the wrong gender because she's female, she's of the wrong kind of trade or profession, you know, because she's a prostitute, but yet, she has this understanding that we don't know how of what God is doing in this region. And God works through her, I would suggest, and then ultimately, she fits in because, yes, she is the mother of Boaz, so she is part of this literal, you know, genealogy of Jesus. And so it's as if there's something deeper going on there. And I think this is an invitation from God saying, those who are outside that don't seem to be part of what I'm doing in the world and that shouldn't really have a place, they actually do. And I think we see this time and time again in Scripture, despite perhaps how authors might have written it. A couple other things I want to highlight is how they understood God in this text. It wasn't the goodness of God, the love of God. It was a fear. And this isn't the like healthy fear of God. This is like a literal fear, like we're going to be destroyed and annihilated. And I think that is a form of violence as well, because that's not a God I'm necessarily drawn to, right? That I better serve this God so I'm not like destroyed and annihilated. But that's what's going on in this text, and those literal words are used in the text, right, in our English translation. So we've got this tension of how they understand God and what maybe perhaps some of her motives were.
And they would have had 40 years for some of the crossing the Red Sea stories, etc., leaving Egypt and all that to migrate up into that area, I guess. So.
Yes. Yeah, so you're hitting on another interesting aspect of this text as well that we can get to. So the first reading of Joshua 2 and then 6, and that's just to give you a quick summary, that's where they march around the wall and they're given very specific instructions of who's to march and who's not, and they're to be silent, and they're to march this many times on certain days, and on the last day, they march 7 times, and they blow their horns, and they shout, and the walls come down, and then they go in and they destroy everybody. Men, women, children, oxen, the works, right? That's what the text says. There's a lot of discussion and scholarship around if that is actually the way it came about. Because again, these were oral traditions that were told time and time again. So you can almost picture like a young child saying, hey, Grandpa, tell me again how we came to be. How did we enter into this land? You know, this is the way I remember stories from my own grandparents, right? You know, they're both deceased now, but they seemed to get a little bit bigger and bigger every time the story was told, right? You know, and a little more interesting. And I find myself wondering if that's what happens in our scripture text sometimes. There's, let me see here in my notes. So one scholar says that there are a list of views on how the entrance into the land actually took place. And these are the 4 views that this scholar lists. A peaceful infiltration, not what we see in the text. A military invasion. A peasant revolution. And a ruralization of the indigenous population. A ruralization. Yes.
R-U-R-A-L?
Yes.
It's hard to say.
Yes. And so to unpack that a bit, if you'll hang with me here, I want to read a kind of an extended statement that focuses on 3 of these. So this is from Walter Brueggemann, one of the foremost Old Testament scholars, and he says this. The older U.S. hypothesis, so this is a hypothesis, I can't say that either, developed here in the United States primarily, he says, is that the conquest of the land of Canaan by Israel under Joshua was a wholesale military onslaught, whereby Israel invaded the land as an effective occupying force and seized much of the land for Israel. Very few scholars have confidence in the capacity of archaeology to suggest such a historical affirmation of biblical texts. So archaeologists are saying, based on what they see in their field, this kind of wholesale military invasion as it's portrayed in the text is not how they understand it. But this is a view that's primarily pushed in the United States. And how did the United States get our start? A wholesale military invasion and an onslaught of people, right? Like that's not the version that we not normally talk about and teach in school, but like that's the honest truth, right? Like it was this idea that God had given a people a land, right? That had been promised, whatever. This is the story of Israel, right? And there would be a lot that would suggest it today. And so it's texts like Joshua that were partially used to justify this idea of what we call manifest destiny.
Do they say what they're seeing in the archaeology that these scholars are talking about that lead them to believe it was not a military conquest?
I don't have the time to dig into all of that, but it's all kinds of things on how, like if the walls really did come down, as it said, and there was this whole like collapse, and then it was never built over again, you know, like it should look a certain way, you know, as they're like digging and uncovering this stuff. And so it's things like that where they're saying it doesn't look like these walls came down, and we're not seeing a million smashed pots and bones everywhere. And it's things of this sort that they're saying as we uncover this site that we believe is Jericho, these are not things that we're seeing that we should be seeing if it happened in this way.
It's the lack of things they're not finding,
Right.
not what they're finding.
So it would be things of that sort, right?
And typically there's a lot of layers
Yes.
over there. They build on top of them.
Yes. All right, so that's some scholarship on one view. Here's a second. A second hypothesis offered in German scholarship is that there was no wholesale military invasion, but that there was a slow and gradual infiltration of Israelites into the land of Canaan, who settled in the most accessible and least desirable places, and so that they consolidated such a presence slowly and began to move into more desirable land, and so into some conflict with the inhabitants of the land. So this one is saying it was actually a slow process, that they kind of started camping over here and claiming a little land over there.
Visiting the brothels.
Perhaps, yeah. You know, kind of establishing themselves, maybe as setting up a business, gaining the trust of people, maybe then buying some land and getting, you know. And so there was this slow process. It wasn't this big military invasion, perhaps, as the text suggests. So that's a German scholarship is one that would kind of suggest that view. Again, not what we see necessarily in the text. And this is, and again, I can't unpack all of it, right? But this is founded in scholarship. This is not like just one person's opinion. This is a whole stream of German scholarship that would suggest this. And then a third that we would focus on would say this. A third hypothesis is that of a peasant revolt. This hypothesis, which is probably increasingly favored among scholars, so this is the most popular one today. It says this, according to this hypothesis, the conflict over the land in Joshua and in Judges is a deep conflict within the population already in the land, so among the Canaanites, the people living there. That is, that there was no invasion, or perhaps only at most a revolutionary cadre of those who brought news of Yahweh from the Exodus. The conflict within the land was concerned with the Canaanites. This hypothesis holds in a widely embraced redefinition that the term Canaanite is not ethnically specific, but is a, I can't say this word either, I can't say it, prerogative, an ideological term to refer to those who had control of the economy, enjoy great concentration of wealth, and occupy the great centers of urban power. As in the case in such power arrangements, the control of urban elites produces intense peasant resentment among those who work the land but are taxed by the urban government, with the consequence that through taxation, the urban elites live well off the work and produce of the peasants. Thus, Canaanite refers to a class of people who abuse the peasants, so that the story concerns the clash of urban elites, the Canaanites, and a resentful peasant, the Israelites. So, if this is more of a class warfare thing, which can be another level of violence, you've got the elites and the non-elites, of which we could probably say Rahab is a non-elite, which speaks to this motivation of why was she doing what she was doing, perhaps. That she's tired of the only place she can find work. And she's tired of the services that she's providing, and she is just barely scraping by for her family.
And her family, as you said, she's the head of the family.
Yes.
Which they're not brought up to do.
Right.
Made it. But
Yeah.
then none of those are very exciting stories for kindergartners.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. A much more exciting
all
story.
a ploy
Right.
to draw the kids in.
Yeah. And so again, if you can go back to that idea of maybe children sitting around and saying, "Hey, Grandpa, tell me that story again of how we came into the land." You know, to say, "Well, son, our family doesn't really come from means, and you know, we never really had anything, and so a group of us got together and we started this slow process of revolt to overthrow the," like that doesn't sell, right? You know. Yeah. You know.
Short of the military idea, I mean, the others are gonna take generations. And, I mean, I would think they're gonna, it's not gonna happen in one generation. It's gonna, you know, if you're gonna infiltrate and you know, it's gonna take generations to accomplish. I don't know how all that lines up with the rest of the book in terms of time, but.
Yeah, I mean, it takes time, for sure, right? You know,
It's gonna take, it's not gonna be done in one generation, that's for sure.
right. But how, you know, I think an important question for us always is how does a text speak to us today in our own context, you know? And so as I've tried to highlight a little bit for you all, you know, I keep talking about layers of violence or systems of oppression, but there's a number of things going on in the text. And I would say today, and this is probably going to ruffle a few feathers, but I would say in our country today, there are deep systems of oppression that have taken generations to establish, you know, that benefit the elite, whether that's based on skin color, socioeconomic status, whatever, but this took generations to establish. And I would suggest that perhaps there are small revolts today that are taking place of people saying, no, this isn't how it should be any longer, you know.
I would suggest also that we are not the only country in the world like that. Almost every country in the western side of the world is like that as well.
Yeah.
Well, in the Middle East, I can say.
Yeah, I haven't been in the East. I can tell you India, I'm going to a ceremony in about 3 weeks of an arranged marriage. And that's how they maintain the class system in India, is through, you know, we've got to marry up. We would never marry our daughter off to someone beneath us.
Right.
And that's how they maintain that class separation.
Yep.
So every country in the world is like that. I don't think the U.S. is unique in that regard.
Yeah.
It's a world problem.
But John, I think if we look at this as a story of faith, that we need to put our faith sometimes in people that we don't look for as being the ones we think are going to give us the answer from God.
Yeah. No, that's
and that we, you know, we continue to try to find what God does, but it's not always, like we don't always get our direction from the pastor.
Yeah.
You know, in that particular one. And one of the favorites we had when in previous times, this is our 4th time going through this lesson. Wouldn't it have been interesting if when Jesus was with all the Pharisees had found the woman and caught in adultery, had written in the sand the names of those 4 women that you just mentioned, and then the old Pharisees would have that they would have realized who those people were and would have backed off. And so it's to me that was a powerful thought, that Rahab's name might have been one that had been written in the sand.
Yeah, that's very possible. Very possible. A couple other things I want to highlight. I'm kind of watching our time that tie in with this, you know, violence of the text. Is in verse 13, when Rahab is speaking. She says, "Give me a sign of good faith that you will spare my father and mother, my brothers and sisters, and all who belong to them." So this is a large group of people, but she specifically says, "and sisters." But then when the men reflect back what they're going to honor, they say, you know, hang the cord up in verse 18, and you do not gather into your house your father, your mother, your brothers, and all of your family. So the sisters are cut out. It could be just a small thing, right? But again, if we're in this mindset of how women are portrayed in this text, that these 2 spies don't even see the sisters as being significant to name. So the only time that they are mentioned in the text is by Rahab.
But they could be included since it's
They could.
your other family.
But it's always important in Scripture to notice who is named and who is not, and who is speaking and who is not. And women, oftentimes in the Scripture text, don't get very many opportunities to speak. And when they do, it's often not believed. Think of the women at the tomb, right? The very first witnesses, the very first evangelists of the resurrection of Jesus. And does anybody really believe them? Right? You know? So another, I think, layer is how these 2 sisters are essentially written out of the story. And this happens to women time and time again. You know? And I think it's really a significant thing of note. And so I want to read a couple of things for you around this. This is written by professor at Brite Divinity School. This is a sermon that she preached that I've taken a couple excerpts from her manuscript that she shared. Her name is Dr. Will Gaffney. She is African American. She is a foremost Hebrew scholar. She's fluent in multiple, like Hebrew and other dialects. She's a womanist theologian, which most people aren't familiar with that term, and is a stream of feminist theology, specifically from the perspective of African American women, because even within feminist theology, it predominantly is done from the perspective of white women and the experience of white women, and there were others that said that doesn't speak to our experience. So there's womanist theology that comes from the perspective of African American women. There's Latina theology that comes specifically from this experience of Hispanic women as well. And so here's a couple of thoughts from Dr. Gaffney, and I'd be happy to send a link to Dennis later that he can share with us. You can read her manuscript in whole. But this is what she says about Rahab. Rahab is the deliverer of her people, her family. She saves her at least 2 sisters and at least 2 brothers, and perhaps their spouses and their children. She says Rahab is determined to save as many of her people as she could, and she succeeded, yet she is remembered as a whore, slut-shamed by the Bible and its readers for all time. I can imagine Rahab looking at her people in the eye after she saved their behinds and saying, "Now, who are you calling a whore? This whore is your savior." Interesting, right? So she continues saying, Rahab's sisters are vulnerable in this passage. They keep disappearing in the mouths of the Israelites. When the spies agreed to her terms in 2:18, they agreed to save her mother, father, brothers, and her father's household. They have erased her sisters and imposed their sense of hierarchy on her household by giving her father a household that is not in this passage, because it is, she's the leader, right, Rahab. The text doesn't even say her father heads a household, but it does say that she, Rahab, does. Rahab works with them in spite of their patriarchy, because sometimes you have to work with what you've got. And everybody ain't free, and everybody ain't trying to get free, she says. Even the Bible doesn't seem fully committed to the liberation of Rahab's sisters. When the Israelites take Jericho, this is in chapter 6, they preserve the lives of Rahab, and again, quote, her mother, father, brothers, and all who belong to her, her whole family. If it weren't for Rahab, we wouldn't know that she even had sisters. Rahab's sisters exist on her lips. She has saved them in and into the scriptures. If we don't call the names of our sisters, no one else will. And then she says, hashtag, say her name, because that's a popular movement at the moment. And don't call her out of it. And again, she asks, who are you calling a whore? And then finally she says, the voices that keep telling us in the text that Rahab is a sex worker, like that's a bad thing, also keep reminding us that she's not an Israelite, like that's a bad thing. She is an outsider, an ethnic minority. She's not one of us. I know Christians like to read the Bible like we're the Israelites, but every once in a while, we need to read from the perspective of the Canaanites. Rahab was everything that Israel hated and feared. A woman, a sexually attractive woman controlling her own sexuality, and a Canaanite woman to boot. But don't count a sister out who fears God, no matter how the deck is stacked against her. Because Rahab knew God, her circumstances were about to change. And God was going to use the very thing that folk would shame her for to transform her life.
Chair, don't you think that I really enjoy this class? I come here to listen to this New Testament and the Old Testament this year. And I read the Old Testament is a story about the people of Israel people, as well as how God worked along the way with his people. Sometimes when you see the stories, pick up the woman, or whoever may be, in the Old Testament, And you see how God very much in the picture to make the situation in a different way. So are some of us in our life. Last time, as I see it, the people who change your direction of your life, and maybe it's not a very significant person, very important person, yet it was God placed her or him in that moment in your life to change the direction.
Yeah.
That's how that is. Old Testament give us story about not only about history of the Jewish people, but give us story how God worked along each step of the way.
Yeah, it's a great comment.
I really appreciate your perspective. I have realized I've kind of Pollyannaed this story, you know, not seeing it from that perspective, but only trying to come at it from an optimistic and positive perspective.
Yeah.
So I really appreciate you bringing this perspective to us.
Yeah, yeah. Like I said, I think, you know, I think especially the Old Testament, it is so complicated, you know, for us as, you know, extreme outsiders of what is going on here. And there's lots of layers to the text that takes a lot of digging. And so you can kind of get a first impression and a second impression. And then if you really want to dig in, you know, you get into some scholarship. And then if you get into scholarship from minority perspectives, so it's not just white European men doing the scholarship, but like this Dr. Gaffney, that is an African-American woman that is highly educated, but not held in the same esteem as her male colleagues. And she deals with that all the time. And her name is Wilfred, I believe is her first name, but she goes by Will. And so she tells stories all the time of how people assume she's a man, right, you know, and all kind, you know, and so this is, again, just assumptions of that she's in higher education, which is a field predominantly driven by men, and there's reasons for that, right, because of systems of oppression, you know. And so something we oftentimes in pastoral care, Henry referenced what kind of a perspective chaplains bring, is that in pastoral care in the hospital setting, we often say the issue isn't really the issue. You know, that someone's presented to the hospital because they've got an infection in their leg, and they're lashing out at staff, and they're really angry, and whatever, you know? And so you're like, all this because they've got an infection in them. Is that really the issue? And sometimes it takes someone willing to listen, a chaplain, oftentimes it's a nurse or something, to sit down and to say, man, I notice you're really upset. Tell me what's more going on. Well, I've got this infection in my leg, but you know, my husband wouldn't take off work to bring me here to the hospital, and it got worse, and now I'm something. So it's not really about this, it's the fact that, you know, you couldn't get a ride to, you know, your doctor's appointments, and then, you know, your infection got worse, and yeah, and I'm always there for everybody else, and I'm always, you know, and so you begin to see these layers of what's going on. The issue oftentimes isn't the issue. And then this text here, I would suggest some of, you know, the initial issue is just this like violence. How do they come by the land, right? I think that's your broad perspective. But within that, I would say there's issues of patriarchy. I would say there's issues of systemic oppression. There's issues of sexual violence. There's issues of gender roles and expectations. Or can you break out of the class that you're in? You know, I would say these are all layers that are present within this text. And so my final thought for you is when you encounter a person in the world today that has a label, undocumented, you know, felon, black, you know, Muslim, and they've got this label, my challenge for you is to begin to try to push, just like we do in this story of Rahab, to see beyond whatever this label is. Because we often label people to other them, right? Be like, oh, well, you don't belong because Rahab's the prostitute, she doesn't really have a place in the story, right? Oh, well, that person's a felon, so, you know, sorry, you know, and to begin to say, what does that label do to them, and how does that contribute to the oppression that they experience, you know? that once you're labeled as a felon, for instance, you can no longer qualify for government subsidized housing. You're cut out on all kinds of job applications because you have to mark that box. And so I would suggest that this is a way that we help create class in the United States. By once someone is labeled a felon, which African Americans go to prison on way more proportionate levels than white, although their population is grossly inverted, right, you know? And this is an aspect of what they call the new Jim Crow, right? Michelle Alexander wrote a phenomenal book, if you would like to read that. I would suggest that's a way that systems of oppression have been created and are upheld in our own country. So we encounter someone that, with this label, perhaps like felon, just like Rahab has this label of prostitute, to dig a little deeper, just like we did in this, and to ask, what are some of the other factors that might be going on that maybe perhaps push someone? I'm not saying, you know, everyone's just a product of their environment, but these things matter, right? The choices that they feel forced to make, these things matter. And one final thought, specifically here in the city of Dallas, I think we have a huge history of systemic oppression and racism. There's a phenomenal book called White Metropolis, Race, Ethnicity, and Religion in Dallas, from 1841 to 2001 by Michael Phillips. And I'll send that to Dennis so he can send it out to you all. It is a phenomenal book that is like painful, painful, painful to read from the perspective of a white man when you see what has occurred, you know, to create systems of oppression in our own city. And we name freeways, buildings, and all these things after these people. And it all comes, in a sense, from labeling someone, just like Rahab, how to label. And so that's why I think the story of Rahab matters today. So I commend you all for choosing to dig in, and I hope I've prompted some really good thought to continue to dig into this text.
Thank you, Chad.
Yeah.
Thanks, Chad.
Yeah.
Okay. Carrie Donaldson. Your son has herniated cervical disc.
On the right.
Surgery on April 30th. So pray for return of strength in arm and remission of pain. So how long has he been dealing with?
Well, as best I can get out of him.
Oh, okay.
About 6 months. He noticed it. He's very into all kinds of extreme sports and very athletic, and he's the one that's the doctor. And anyway, he noticed in the gym, lifting weights.
Oh, yeah.
But it was a blessing. Because he was having pain, but it, kind of like me, it wasn't bad enough to go to the doctor just for that.
Right, right.
But when he noticed the weakness, yeah, so he's been through the whole workup, and he's having surgery on the
Okay. I forgot your son's first name.
Lance.
Lance, that's right. Okay.
And that's what we call him. That's his middle name.
Okay.
But I'm praying, we're really praying hard, because that's his dominant arm. And he does a lot of interventional radiology. And,
Okay. Looks like Dennis has mentioned all of our class members that are traveling.
Yeah, we
So
got 6 out for travel
Right, that would be the Tebows
in London,
in London, and then Vicky Beasley, is she up in
in
Oklahoma?
India,
Oh,
India and UAE.
oh, she's in India.
Our house is for sale up in
Okay,
Oklahoma.
yeah, that's,
Yeah.
okay.
And then
And then Michael and Maria,
they're in Mexico City this
Michael
weekend.
Cox and Maria, how do you say her last name? Coelho?
I think so.
Cuello.
Coelho?
C-U-E-L-L.
They are traveling to Mexico City. Diana asks for prayers for that her parents' house will sell and that they would give a reasonable offer. She also asked for prayers Diana asked for prayers for Tracy, Sturdivant.
Yeah.
Okay. He's traveling
In
for
Taiwan.
business in Taiwan. And Linda asked for prayers for her brother Eric and his wife Renee as they struggle with communication challenges. Okay.
So that's 7 in our class that are out of the country.
Yes. Does anyone want to add any other prayer requests?